There are dynasties that echo through history, names like the Tudors, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, households that wielded power and left indelible marks on the world. But what about the ones that vanished into the shadows, their stories whispered rather than shouted? Among them, none are more enigmatic than the Merovingians, a dynasty that ruled vast swaths of Europe, only to fade into legend, their legacy tangled in myth, mystery, and the kind of intrigue that makes historians lean in closer. Picture this, a bloodline said to descend from a mythical sea creature, kings who wore their hair long as a symbol of divine right, and a fall so abrupt it sparked conspiracy theories for centuries. This is the story of how a family rose from obscurity to dominate early medieval Europe, and then disappeared, leaving behind questions we're still trying to answer today. What if I told you that the very fabric of European history was shaped by a dynasty most people have never heard of? The Merovingians weren't just rulers, they were the architects of a world in transition, bridging the gap between the fallen Roman Empire and the rise of the kingdoms we recognize today. Their reign was one of conquest, spirituality, and political cunning, yet their end came not with a bang but with a whisper, ushered out by their own successors, the Carolingians, who rewrote history to erase them. But why? What secrets did the Merovingians hold that made them so dangerous to remember? And how did a line of kings, once so powerful, become little more than a footnote, their true influence buried under layers of legend and deliberate omission? This isn't just a tale of kings and battles. It's a puzzle, one that stretches from the shadowy forests of ancient Gaul to the glittering courts of medieval Europe. It's about faith, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to control the past. As we peel back the layers of myth, we'll uncover how the Merovingians rose from tribal leaders to unifiers of a fractured continent, only to be toppled by the very forces they helped create. Along the way, we'll meet warrior kings, scheming queens, and saints who may have rewritten history to suit their own ends. By the end, you'll see why this forgotten dynasty still captivates us, and why their ghosts linger in the stories we tell about power, legacy, and the price of greatness. So let's step into the world of the Merovingians, where history and legend collide, and nothing is quite as it seems. Every great dynasty begins with a story, sometimes history, sometimes myth, but always a tale that shapes how the world sees them. For the Merovingians, that story starts with a king named Merovech, a figure so shrouded in mystery that even his existence is debated. According to Frankish legend, he wasn't just born, he was chosen, touched by something otherworldly. Some chronicles claim his father was a Frankish warlord, while others whisper of a far stranger lineage. The Quinotaur, a sea creature said to rise from the waves, half bull, half fish, a symbol of raw, untamed power. Imagine the scene, a ruler whose very bloodline was said to be intertwined with the primal forces of nature, a claim that set the Merovingians apart as something more than mere mortals. But how much of this is fact and how much is fabrication? Historians still argue over whether Merovech was a real leader or a later invention, a way to give the dynasty an aura of divine right. What we do know is this: by the time his descendants came to power in the 5th century, they'd already mastered the art of blending myth and politics. Long hair, uncut and flowing, became their trademark, a deliberate echo of biblical figures like Samson, a visual declaration that their strength and authority came from God himself. It wasn't just about looking the part, it was about crafting an identity so potent that no rival could challenge it. Yet behind the legends, the Merovingians were also ruthlessly practical. They emerged from the chaos of Rome's collapse, shrewdly marrying into other Frankish clans, forging alliances and consolidating power piece by piece. Their rise wasn't just destiny, it was strategy, and that's the fascinating tension at the heart of their origins. Were they the chosen ones of myth, or simply the best players in a brutal game of thrones? The answer, like so much about them, lies somewhere in between. Among the shadowy figures of early Merovingian history, one name blazes brighter than the rest: Clovis I, the warrior king who transformed his people from warring tribes into a unified force that would dominate Europe. If the dynasty's origins were wrapped in myth, Clovis made them undeniable fact through sheer ambition and ruthless strategy. His reign wasn't just about conquest, it was a masterclass in how to wield faith, fear, and force to forge an empire. Picture Gaul in the late 5th century, a fractured landscape where Roman influence had crumbled, leaving a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each jockeying for dominance. Into this chaos stepped Clovis, barely 15, when he inherited a small Frankish realm centered around modern-day Belgium. Most rulers would have been crushed by the pressure, but Clovis saw opportunity. With a mix of battlefield brilliance and political cunning, he began systematically dismantling his rivals. His first major strike came against the last Roman governor in northern Gaul, Syagrius, whose defeat sent a clear message: the old order was dead and the Franks were rising. But Clovis's true genius lay in understanding that swords alone couldn't secure loyalty. His most legendary moment came at the Battle of Tolbiac, facing the Alemanni, a formidable Germanic tribe. As the fighting turned desperate, chroniclers claim Clovis cried out to the Christian god, vowing to convert if granted victory. Whether divine intervention or sheer tactical skill won the day, the Franks triumphed and Clovis kept his word. His baptism by Saint Remigius in Rheims wasn't just a personal conversion. It was a seismic political act. By embracing Christianity, Clovis gained the backing of the powerful Gallo-Roman clergy and positioned himself as God's chosen ruler, a narrative that would define Merovingian legitimacy for centuries. Yet for all the grandeur of his baptism, Clovis never let piety soften his edge. In the years that followed, he methodically expanded his territory, outmaneuvering or outright slaughtering rival Frankish kings, even those who were his own relatives. One chilling account describes how he invited a fellow Frankish leader to talks, only to have his guest assassinated mid-conversation. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had united nearly all the Franks under one crown, laying the foundation for what would become modern France. His legacy wasn't just land or gold, it was a blueprint for power, one that mixed faith, ferocity, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. What makes Clovis fascinating isn't just what he achieved, but how he did it. He wasn't a saint despite his conversion, nor a mindless brute. He was a strategist who understood that to rule a fractured world, you needed both the sword and the cross. His reign set the template for medieval kingship, proving that in the wreckage of Rome, only those who could balance divine mandate with raw strength would survive. And though later Merovingians would falter, none would ever match the sheer audacity of the first great king, the man who turned a dynasty of legends into a dynasty of empires. Clovis may have forged the Merovingian kingdom through blood and baptism, but it was a legal code written in Latin on parchment that would cement his dynasty's control over daily life. Enter the Salic Law, a sprawling set of rules carved out in the early 6th century, a time when most of Europe relied on oral tradition or the whims of warlords. Imagine the shock of a Frankish farmer suddenly handed a written decree detailing everything from the price of stolen livestock to the consequences for slandering the king. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a revolution in how power worked. At its core, the Salic Law was about two things: order and identity. By codifying punishments for crimes, fines measured in silver for everything from murder to cutting someone's hair without permission, it replaced tribal vengeance with a system that funneled authority straight to the crown. But the real stroke of genius, the law's obsession with defining who belonged. Only those who could trace Frankish ancestry back generations enjoyed full rights under its protections. Outsiders, even long-time residents, faced higher fines or harsher penalties. In one move, the Merovingians turned legal language into a weapon. binding loyalty to bloodline and making their rule synonymous with Frankish identity itself. Then came the bombshell buried in the legal dry text, the infamous Salic Law. Women, it declared, could not inherit land. On the surface, this seemed like simple patriarchy, but the implications were seismic. By blocking female inheritance, the Merovingians ensured their realm wouldn't fracture through royal marriages or external claims. Power stayed locked within the family, or so they thought. Because the law had a flaw its creators never anticipated. Every time a Merovingian king died, his lands were divided equally among his sons, a tradition meant to prevent feuds but one that slowly bled the kingdom dry. Picture a map of Francia splitting like cracked glass with each generation, brothers ruling petty kingdoms while eyeing each other's borders. The irony is thick enough to taste. The same laws meant to strengthen the dynasty planted the seeds of its unraveling. As the 6th century wore on, Merovingian princes became less united rulers and more rival warlords, their power diluted by constant partitions. Yet even fractured, the system held because the Salic Law had done its job too well. The idea of Frankish unity, of a people bound by custom and code, outlasted the kings themselves. Long after the Merovingians faded, their legal legacy endured, shaping everything from medieval succession disputes to the very concept of nationhood. Not bad for a set of rules scribbled down 1500 years ago by clerks working under flickering candlelight. The Merovingian Golden Age wasn't built by one king alone. It was a symphony of ambition, with each ruler adding their own verse to the dynasty's crescendo. After Clovis's death in 511, his kingdom split among 4 sons, a fracture that should have weakened the Franks. Instead, it sparked a fierce competition that propelled them to new heights. Theuderic I, Clovis's eldest, carved out the eastern realm of Austrasia, while his brothers pushed westward into Aquitaine and Burgundy. What could have been a slow unraveling became something else entirely, a family turning rivalry into fuel for conquest. Take Theuderic's campaign against the Thuringians in 531. While his brothers squabbled over their shares of Gaul, he led his armies deep into Germanic lands, crushing a rival kingdom and dragging its treasure back to Metz. But here's the twist. This wasn't just about loot. Theuderic understood that to rule, you needed more than fear, you needed spectacle. His victories weren't just military, they were theater, dazzling displays meant to remind everyone, allies and enemies alike, that the Merovingians were untouchable. And it worked. By the time his nephew Clotaur I reunited the fractured realms in the mid-6th century, the Franks weren't just a collection of tribes. They were the dominant power west of the Rhine, their influence stretching from the Pyrenees to the edges of Saxony. Yet expansion alone doesn't explain their golden age. The real secret lay in how they governed. Unlike the Romans, who imposed their systems on conquered peoples, the Merovingians were pragmatists. In Burgundy, they let local dukes keep their titles. In Aquitaine, they preserved Roman administrative traditions. This wasn't weakness, it was genius. By allowing regional elites a taste of power, they turned potential rebels into stakeholders, weaving a patchwork kingdom strong enough to bend but never break. Even the church became a partner, with Merovingian kings founding monasteries like political outposts, their abbots doubling as diplomats and spies. Then there's the cultural legacy, often overlooked but just as vital. The Merovingian court at Metz became a hub for artisans, with goldsmiths crafting intricate jewelry that fused Roman elegance with Frankish boldness. Their coins bore Latin inscriptions, a deliberate nod to the empire they'd replaced, while their legal reforms blended Germanic custom with Christian morality. This was a dynasty that didn't just conquer, it curated, creating a hybrid culture that would define medieval Europe for centuries. But perhaps their most enduring achievement was the way they reshaped Europe's political imagination. Before the Merovingians, kingdom meant something fluid, lands held by whoever had the strongest arm. under their rule it began to mean something more, a realm bound by law, faith, and bloodline. When Clotaire died in 561, his sons divided the kingdom again, yet this time no one questioned whether Francia would endure. The idea had taken root. That's the paradox of their golden age, a dynasty that kept splitting itself apart, yet somehow left the map more united than ever. Long before crowns and scepters became the universal symbols of royalty, the Merovingians wielded a far more personal mark of divine favor, their hair. Uncut, flowing, and deliberately untouched by shears, these kings wore their locks like living coronation robes, a physical manifestation of their sacred right to rule. In a world where most men kept their hair short for practicality or fashion, a Merovingian's tresses weren't just style, they were theology woven into flesh. The message was unmistakable. To cut a Merovingian's hair wasn't just an insult, it was sacrilege, a severing of the divine connection that legitimized their power. This wasn't mere vanity. The tradition traced back to biblical archetypes like Samson, whose strength vanished when Delilah shorn his hair, or the Nazarites, who vowed never to touch a blade to their heads as a sign of devotion. By adopting this symbolism, the Merovingians positioned themselves as more than warlords. They were God's anointed, their bodies literal vessels of sacred authority. Chroniclers of the time described their hair as glorious, shimmering with an almost supernatural sheen, a detail that turned royal grooming into propaganda. Imagine a young prince presented to his people for the first time, his uncut hair draping past his shoulders, a living contract between heaven and earth. But like all potent symbols, its power made it a target. When the Merovingian grip began to weaken in the 7th century, their hair became the battlefield. The Carolingian mayors of the palace, who'd slowly usurped real political control, faced a dilemma. They couldn't outright overthrow the sacred bloodline without sparking rebellion. So they devised a brutal workaround. Deposed Merovingian kings, often mere children, were publicly shorn, their sacred locks sheared off like common criminals before being tossed into monasteries. The act was as calculated as an execution. Stripped of their divine marker, these do-nothing kings became shadows, their authority neutered not by force but by symbolism. What's fascinating is how this erosion mirrors the dynasty's broader decline. Just as their hair was gradually clipped away, so too was their power, not in one dramatic coup but in slow, deliberate snips. By the time the last Merovingian, Childeric III, was tonsured in 751, the act felt almost ceremonial. The Carolingians had already rewritten the rules of legitimacy, swapping hair for papal endorsement and military might. Yet even then, the old magic lingered. Centuries later, Frankish chroniclers still whispered about the long-haired kings, a phrase heavy with lost grandeur. The lesson here isn't just about fashion or faith. It's about how power sustains itself through spectacle, and how, when that spectacle fades, so does the throne. The Merovingians understood this better than anyone. They built an empire on symbolism as much as swords, and when the symbols were taken, the empire followed. In the end, their hair wasn't just a style. It was the thread holding their entire claim together, and once cut, there was no going back. The Merovingian throne, once a seat of warrior kings like Clovis, slowly transformed into something far stranger, a dynasty of figureheads known to history as the Rois Fainéants, the so-called do-nothing kings. By the 7th century, the royal bloodline had become a paradox, sacred in name but hollow in power. Picture a teenage boy, barely old enough to grow the dynasty's signature long hair, paraded before crowds in gilded wagons drawn by oxen, a king in ceremony only, while the real business of ruling happened behind closed doors. The throne had become a puppet show, and the puppeteers were the mayors of the palace, a title that sounds bureaucratic but masked staggering ambition. These mayors started as royal stewards, managing estates and organizing armies for their Merovingian masters. but like chess players who slowly take every piece on the board, they expanded their role until kings became ornamental. The shift wasn't sudden, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Take Dagobert II, one of the last active Merovingian rulers. His assassination in 679 left a child heir, and from that moment the mayors never relinquished control. They drafted laws, led armies, even negotiated with foreign powers, all in the name of a king who could do little more than sign his name. Enter Pepin of Herstal, the mayor who turned shadows into substance. While weak Merovingian kings lounged in their palaces, Pepin crushed rebellions in Neustria, subdued the Frisians, and united Frankish factions under his de facto rule. His power play was subtle but devastating. He let the kings keep their titles, their hair, even their thrones, but stripped away everything that made kingship meaningful. When a rival faction tried to restore royal authority, Pepin didn't bother with regicide. Instead, he simply ignored the king, rendering him irrelevant. Here's the twist: the mayors didn't destroy the Merovingian myth, they needed it. The bloodline's sacred aura was too useful to discard outright, so they kept the kings like religious relics wheeled out for ceremonies, then locked away again. It was a brilliant con. The mayors shouldered the messy work of governance while the dynasty's mysticism legitimized their actions. Nobody questioned Pepin's right to rule because technically he wasn't ruling, he was just advising a divinely appointed king. Yet the system had a flaw. With each generation, the mayors grew bolder, their power more naked. By the time Charles Martel, Pepin's son, led the Franks to victory against invading Muslim forces at Tours in 732, it was clear who really wore the crown in all but name. The Merovingians still sat on the throne, but their hands were empty. And when you've spent centuries pretending a puppet is sovereign, sooner or later, someone cuts the strings. What makes this era fascinating isn't just the political chess match, it's how thoroughly image outweighed reality. The mayors understood something modern leaders still grapple with: power isn't just about control. It's about perception. They proved you could rewrite an empire's rules without ever touching the throne, as long as the world kept believing the old stories. And in that, they were the Merovingians' truest heirs, masters of the very game the dynasty had invented. Charles Martel didn't just rise to power, he seized it from the shadows, a master of political theater who knew when to wield a hammer and when to let others believe they still held the reins. By the early 8th century, the Merovingian kings had become little more than ceremonial relics, their long hair and royal titles masking their utter irrelevance. But while they played at sovereignty, Martel, as mayor of the palace, was rewriting the rules of warfare and governance, turning the Frankish realm into a military machine that would define medieval Europe. His nickname, the Hammer, wasn't just for show. It was a promise: strike hard, strike decisively, and leave no doubt who truly ruled. The key to Martel's dominance lay in his revolutionary approach to war. Unlike the old Frankish armies, which relied on tribal levies and aristocratic warriors, he built a professional fighting force loyal not to the king but to him. He redistributed church lands to fund his campaigns, creating a new class of mounted warriors bound by personal allegiance, the embryonic knights of feudalism. These weren't just soldiers, they were investments, men who owed their status to Martel's favor and would follow him to the gates of hell if he asked. And in 732, hell came to them. The Umayyad Caliphate, fresh from conquering Iberia, pushed north into Gaul, their cavalry cutting through Aquitaine like a scythe through wheat. For the Franks, this wasn't just another border skirmish, it was an existential threat. Martel met them near Poitiers in a clash later mythologized as the Battle of Tours. The details are foggy, chroniclers disagree on numbers, tactics, even the exact date, but the outcome reshaped Europe. Martel's disciplined infantry held firm against the Umayyad charges, their shields locking into a wall that broke the invaders' momentum. By the time the Umayyad commander fell, the tide had turned. The caliphate's advance into Europe halted, not with a treaty but with a hammer blow. Yet for all its battlefield glory, Tour's real significance was political. Martel returned not just as a hero, but as the unquestioned power behind a crumbling facade. He didn't bother deposing the Merovingian king, Theuderic IV. Why risk the backlash when the throne was already a prop? Instead, he let the fiction continue, even as he parceled out lands to his loyalists and consolidated control over the church. His genius was in understanding that legitimacy isn't just about crowns, it's about perception. By the time of his death in 741, the Merovingians were ghosts in their own palace, their rituals empty, their authority a whisper. Martel's legacy wasn't just in stopping an invasion or sidelining kings. It was in proving that power, once stripped of its illusions, never returns to those who lose it. He didn't just overshadow the Merovingians, he made them irrelevant, their sacred hair and ancient bloodlines no match for the hard, unglamorous work of ruling. And when his son Pepin finally cut the last threads of their legitimacy a decade later, it wasn't a revolution, it was just paperwork. The hammer had already done the work. If the Merovingian kings ruled by divine right and battlefield prowess, their queens wielded power through an altogether different arsenal: intrigue, diplomacy, and sometimes outright murder. At a time when women were often sidelined in chronicles, figures like Brunhilde and Fredegund carved their names into history with the sharp edge of political genius, proving that the throne's real battles were often fought in bedchambers and banquet halls rather than on open fields. Take Brunhilde, a Visigothic princess married into the Merovingian Dynasty in the late 6th century. Far from a passive consort, she became a master of statecraft, ruling first as regent for her young son, then as the power behind multiple thrones. Her network of alliances stretched across Europe. She negotiated with Byzantine emperors, brokered peace between warring Frankish factions, and even oversaw the construction of roads and fortresses. Yet her greatest weapon was longevity. While Merovingian kings burned out young, Brunhilde endured for decades, weathering assassinations, coups, and the deaths of 3 successive royal husbands. Her reign was a testament to how patience could outmuscle brute force, but standing in her shadow was Fredegund, Brunhilde's most vicious rival, a former slave turned queen who played the game with fewer scruples and more daggers. Where Brunhilde relied on diplomacy, Fredegund embraced raw cunning. Chronicles accuse her of poisoning her husband's first wife, arranging the murder of Brunhilde's sister, and even personally stabbing an enemy bishop to death during a private audience. Yet dismissing her as merely ruthless misses the point. Fredegund understood propaganda, framing her enemies as traitors while positioning herself as a defender of royal authority. When her own son, Clovis II, inherited the throne as an infant, she ruled with such efficiency that the kingdom prospered despite her reputation. The feud between these two women wasn't just personal, it was a cold war that split Francia. Brunhilde, based in Austrasia, championed centralized power through royal authority. Fredegund, ruling Neustria, leaned on the nobility. Their conflict escalated from poisonings and betrayals to full-scale battles, culminating in a grisly end for Brunhilde. In 613, at the age of 70, she was captured by Fredegund's son, tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged to her death, a brutal coda to a lifetime of power plays. What makes these queens extraordinary isn't just their ruthlessness, but how they exposed the fragility of Merovingian rule. In a dynasty where kings were increasingly figureheads, Brunhilde and Fredegund proved that real authority didn't require a crown, just the will to grasp it. Their stories also reveal a paradox. Their brilliance prolonged the dynasty's dominance, but their feuds drained its strength, leaving it vulnerable to the Carolingian takeover. The Merovingians didn't just fall because of weak kings, they collapsed under the weight of queens too powerful to share a kingdom. Clovis's baptism in the late 5th century wasn't just a personal conversion, it was a political earthquake. By aligning himself with the Christian God, he didn't just secure a heavenly ally, he gained the backing of the Gallo-Roman clergy, the last remnants of Rome's administrative elite. Overnight, the church became the Merovingians' most powerful propagandist, weaving their rule into sermons and chronicles as divinely ordained. Bishops anointed kings, churches doubled as tax collection points, and miracles were conveniently attributed to royal prayers. But this alliance wasn't charity. The church gained protection, land, and influence in return, creating a symbiotic relationship where faith and power were inseparable. Yet by the 7th century, cracks appeared. As Merovingian kings grew weaker, the church's ambitions grew bolder. Bishops like Leodega of Autun didn't just advise rulers, they deposed them, manipulating succession disputes to install puppets. Monasteries, once loyal crown assets, became independent power centers, their abbots richer than kings. The irony was thick. The very institution that had legitimized the dynasty now undermined it, playing kingmaker while Merovingians languished in luxury. The turning point came with the rise of the Carolingians. Charles Martel's seizure of church lands to fund his armies should have sparked rebellion. Instead, the clergy traded land for protection, betting on the mayors over their fading kings. By the time Pope Stephen anointed Pepin the Short in 751, the deal was sealed. The church needed a strongman, not a figurehead. In the end, the Merovingians learned too late that divine right means little without earthly swords to enforce it. Their greatest ally became the architect of their irrelevance. Beneath the shadow of Merovingian kings and queens, another revolution was unfolding, one of ink, chisel, and gold. While the dynasty's political power waned, its cultural influence blossomed, leaving behind artifacts so meticulously crafted they still dazzle centuries later. Take the buckle of Queen Arnegund, Clothar I's wife, discovered in her tomb, an intricate masterpiece of garnet and gold, its geometric patterns echoing both Roman precision and Frankish boldness. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a statement, proof that the so-called Dark Ages shimmered with artistry. Monasteries became the beating hearts of this creative surge. Luxeuil Abbey, founded by the Irish missionary Columbanus in the late 6th century, transformed into a scriptorium where scribes bent over parchment under flickering candlelight. Here, the Merovingians perfected the uncial script, a rounded, elegant handwriting that made sacred texts leap off the page, but their real genius lay in fusion. Look closely at a Merovingian manuscript like the Gelasian Sacramentary, and you'll spot Celtic knots tangled with Roman capitals, crosses blooming into vine-like tendrils. These weren't mere decorations, they were visual sermons blending traditions to convert through beauty. Then there was architecture. The Basilica of St. Denis, rebuilt under Dagobert I, introduced a radical idea, light as divinity. Its windows, larger than anything seen since Rome's fall, flooded the interior with sunlight, a metaphor for heavenly grace. Pilgrims who entered didn't just see a church, they experienced a Merovingian vision of heaven on earth, where Frankish kings positioned themselves as intermediaries between God and man. Even their coins told stories. Struck with Latin mottos and portraits of long-haired rulers, they circulated from Paris to Pavia, advertising the dynasty's reach. A Merovingian silver denarius wasn't just currency, it was a tiny propaganda leaflet asserting authority in every marketplace. What makes their artistic legacy extraordinary isn't just its beauty, but its ambition. In an era of fractured kingdoms, the Merovingians used culture as glue, crafting a visual language that said, "We are the heirs of Rome, the guardians of faith, the makers of a new world." When Charlemagne later sought to revive classical art, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was standing on shoulders the Merovingians had quietly strengthened for generations. Theirs was a forgotten renaissance, one that proved power isn't just won by swords, it's sealed by splendor. By the early 7th century, the Merovingian dynasty was teetering, not from external enemies, but from its own internal fractures. Then came Dagobert I, a king who refused to let his family's legacy crumble. Crowned in 629, he inherited a realm split by decades of civil war, where regional nobles routinely ignored royal decrees and rival branches of the family plotted over the carcass of Francia. Yet within a decade, Dagobert would pull off something astonishing, the last truly unified Merovingian reign. His secret, a mix of ruthless pragmatism and cultural savvy that few of his predecessors had matched. Take his approach to the aristocracy, a class that had grown dangerously independent. Instead of confronting them head-on, Dagobert outmaneuvered them. He appointed loyal bishops to key cities, using the church as a counterweight to noble power. In Paris, he established a royal court that became the beating heart of Frankish politics, luring regional lords with lavish feasts and strategic marriages. But beneath the pageantry lurked steel. When the Burgundian nobleman Willibald plotted rebellion, Dagobert didn't negotiate. He had the man dragged from his bed and executed, sending a message that echoed across the kingdom. Then there were his economic reforms. While earlier Merovingians had relied on plunder, Dagobert understood that lasting power needed gold, not just glory. He standardized coinage, boosting trade from the Rhineland to the Mediterranean. His mints produced silver denarii stamped with his likeness and the Latin motto Dagobertus Rex, turning every transaction into a tiny act of loyalty. Even his choice of St. Denis as a royal burial site was strategic. By enriching the abbey with land grants, he tied the monarchy's prestige to a sacred space that would outlast any single reign. Yet for all his brilliance, Dagobert's greatest failure was one he couldn't control: time. When he died in 639, just 10 years into his reign, the kingdom fractured once more, divided between his young sons. The nobles, momentarily cowed, saw their chance and pounced. Within a generation, the mayors of the palace had reduced Dagobert's heirs to puppets. The irony. His very success had made him an anomaly. By proving a strong Merovingian was possible, he'd inadvertently highlighted how rare such rulers had become. What lingers about Dagobert isn't just what he achieved, but what his reign revealed. He was the last Merovingian to wield real power, the last whose word could raise armies or reshape laws. After him, the throne became a stage prop, the kings merely players reciting lines written by others. His tomb at St. Denis, once meant to symbolize eternal dynasty, instead became a monument to what might have been, a reminder that even the greatest rulers are only as strong as the system they leave behind. If the Merovingian dynasty had a recurring nightmare, it was the specter of succession, an endless cycle of brother turning against brother, sons inheriting not just kingdoms but blood feuds that stretched across generations. The root of this turmoil lay in a single, deadly tradition: partible inheritance. Unlike primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything, Frankish law demanded territory be divided equally among all male heirs. On paper, this seemed fair. In practice, it was a recipe for civil war, slicing the kingdom into ever smaller fragments while pitting sibling against sibling in a zero-sum game of thrones. Take the aftermath of Clovis's death in 511. His realm, painstakingly unified through decades of conquest, was instantly split among 4 sons. Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar each received a share, with borders drawn not by natural geography but by brute arithmetic. At first, they cooperated, joining forces to crush the Burgundians in 523. But when Clodomir fell in battle, the veneer of unity shattered. Childebert and Clothar invited their nephews to Paris under the guise of protection, only to murder 2 and exile the 3rd, seizing their dead brother's lands. The surviving nephew, Clodoald, chose the cowl over the crown, slicing off his Merovingian hair in a dramatic renunciation of power. His self-inflicted tonsure spoke volumes: better to live as a monk than die as a pawn in this family's lethal chess match. By the mid-6th century, the partitions grew even more absurd. Clothar I briefly reunited the kingdom through a mix of luck and fratricide. only to see it split again among his own 4 sons. This generation's infighting reached operatic heights. Sigebert of Austrasia and Chilperic of Neustria escalated their rivalry into open warfare, their hatred fueled by their wives Brunhilda and Fredegund, who turned personal vendettas into state policy. When Sigebert was assassinated in 575, Brunhilda didn't mourn. She ruled through her son, then her grandsons, orchestrating a 50-year reign that saw Merovingian kings die as swiftly as they were crowned. Meanwhile, Fredegund countered with poison and daggers, her network of spies ensuring no rival slept soundly. The toll of these wars wasn't just measured in bodies. The constant splintering of territory weakened central authority, emboldening regional nobles and mayors to act like kings in their own right. By the time Dagobert I temporarily halted the cycle in the 7th century, the damage was irreversible. The kingdom had become a patchwork of semi-independent fiefdoms, its rulers too busy fighting each other to notice the Carolingians rising in their shadows. What's chilling isn't just the violence, it's the inevitability. The Merovingians weren't destroyed by external enemies, but by a system they themselves created. Their laws, designed to prevent dynastic extinction, instead guaranteed it, turning every succession into a roll of the dice where the stakes weren't just power but survival. In the end, their greatest rival wasn't Rome or the Lombards or even the Church. It was their own blood. The Merovingian kings still sat on their thrones, their long hair untouched and their rituals observed. But real power had slipped into the hands of a family that worked in whispers rather than war cries. The Carolingians didn't storm the palace gates, they picked the locks one by one, turning themselves from royal servants into shadow kings. It began with Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the palace, who realized something revolutionary. You didn't need to wear a crown to rule, only to control the man who did. After crushing his rivals at the Battle of Tertry in 687, he didn't bother claiming the throne. Instead, he let the Merovingian puppet kings reign while he controlled the armies, the taxes, and the bishops. His power was so absolute that when he died in 714, the kingdom didn't pass to the Merovingians, it passed to his illegitimate son, Charles Martel, a man who would wield power like a hammer. Martel's reign marked the point of no return. While the Merovingian kings played at sovereignty, he rebuilt the Frankish military from the ground up, creating the first true cavalry force in Europe, a fighting elite loyal not to the crown but to him personally. When the Umayyad Caliphate surged north into Gaul in 732, it was Martel, not the Merovingian king, who rallied the Franks at Tours and turned the tide of history. The victory didn't just repel an invasion, it cemented a new reality. The man who saved Christendom couldn't possibly be a mere servant to a do-nothing king. Yet even then, Martel resisted the throne. He understood the Merovingian symbolic value. Their bloodline still held a sacred aura, and deposing them outright might spark rebellion. Better to let the fiction linger while he pulled the strings. Then came the masterstroke. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, faced a problem his father had avoided: legitimacy. By the mid-8th century, the Carolingians held all the power, but titles matter in a world that still whispered of divine right. So Pepin asked the question that would reshape Europe: what use is a king who doesn't rule? With the Merovingian Childeric III reduced to a ceremonial figurehead, Pepin turned to the one institution that could sanctify his claim, the Church. In 751, he sent envoys to Pope Zachary, posing a cleverly loaded query: should the man with the title hold power or the man who actually wielded it? The Pope, needing a strong ally against Lombard threats, gave the answer Pepin wanted. Childeric was tonsured, his sacred hair shorn, and sent to a monastery while Pepin was anointed king in a ceremony steeped in biblical symbolism. The Carolingians weren't usurpers, they were God's new chosen. The brilliance of their rise lay in its patience. They didn't conquer the Merovingians, they made them obsolete, replacing sacred blood with papal approval and military might. By the time Pepin's son Charlemagne built an empire, the Merovingians were already fading into legend, a cautionary tale about how power, once lost, is rarely reclaimed. The Carolingians didn't just inherit a kingdom, they wrote the playbook for how to stage a coup without ever drawing a sword. Pepin the Short didn't just take the throne, he rewrote the rules of what it meant to be king. By the time he maneuvered his way to power in 751, the Merovingian Dynasty had been reduced to hollow ceremony. Their kings paraded like relics while the Carolingians pulled every string. But Pepin faced a problem his predecessors hadn't: legitimacy. The Franks still whispered about the sacred bloodline, the divine right of long-haired kings. To overthrow the last Merovingian, Childeric III, outright would risk rebellion, so Pepin devised a masterstroke. He wouldn't seize power by force alone. He'd get the church to anoint his coup as God's will. The plot hinged on a single, loaded question sent to Pope Zachary: who should rule, the man with the title or the man who actually wields power? It was a brilliant trap. The Pope, desperate for Frankish military support against the Lombards, couldn't afford neutrality. His reply was everything Pepin needed: better the one who has the power. With those words, the church became an accomplice. Childeric was dragged from his palace, his sacred hair shorn in a humiliating public spectacle, then tossed into a monastery like discarded furniture. The act wasn't just symbolic, it was surgical. By stripping the last Merovingian of his divine marker, Pepin turned a bloodline of kings into a footnote overnight. But the real genius came next. Pepin didn't just claim the throne, he sanctified it. In a carefully staged ceremony at Soissons, the Bishop Boniface anointed him with holy oil, a ritual borrowed from biblical kings like David. This wasn't tradition, it was innovation. Where the Merovingians had leaned on pagan ancestry and hair as symbols, Pepin tied his legitimacy to papal blessing and Christian rite. The message was clear: God had chosen a new dynasty. To reinforce it, he even convinced Pope Stephen to travel to Francia in 754, where the pontiff personally crowned him again, sealing the Carolingian claim with Rome's stamp of approval. Yet the coup's brilliance lay in its restraint. Pepin didn't purge the old regime, he absorbed it. Merovingian laws stayed on the books, their administrators kept their posts, even their coin designs lingered for a time. This wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. By preserving the shell of the old order, Pepin made his revolution feel less like a rupture and more like a natural evolution. The Franks barely blinked as their world shifted beneath them. What makes this moment pivotal isn't just the fall of one dynasty and rise of another. It's how power was redefined. Pepin proved that legitimacy wasn't inherited. It could be manufactured, blessed into existence by the right allies. His son Charlemagne would later build an empire on that lesson, but the blueprint was pure Pepin. Control the narrative and the throne will follow. The Merovingians hadn't just been replaced, they'd been outplayed. Childeric III never stood a chance. By the time he was crowned in 743, likely a teenager with the long, uncut hair of his ancestors, the Merovingian throne had become little more than a prop. The Carolingians, led by Charles Martel and later his son Pepin the Short, controlled every lever of power. Childeric's role: to sit silently in his ox-drawn cart during ceremonies, a living relic wheeled out to reassure the people that tradition still held. But when Pepin decided the charade had outlived its usefulness, the last Merovingian king's fate was sealed with cold precision. In 751, under the pretense of consulting the Pope, Pepin made his move. Childeric was seized, stripped of his royal vestments, and subjected to the ultimate humiliation, a public shearing. Those sacred locks, the very symbol of Merovingian divinity, fell to the floor like a severed covenant. With his hair shorn and his status annulled, he was bundled off to the monastery of St. Bertin, not as a guest but as a prisoner. The place chosen for his exile was telling: a quiet, isolated abbey in northern Francia, far from any sympathetic nobles who might rally around the fallen king. What happened next is shrouded in silence. Chronicles mention neither his death date nor his burial site, an eerie omission for a man once anointed by God. Some historians believe he lived out his days in obscurity, perhaps even forced to take monastic vows. Others speculate darker ends, a quiet poisoning, an accidental fall down monastery stairs. The Carolingians had every reason to ensure he never became a martyr, but the most intriguing theory isn't about his death, it's about his bloodline. Whispers persisted for centuries that Childeric's line survived in secret. Medieval genealogies from Aquitaine speak of a shadowy branch of the family, their hair cautiously trimmed to avoid suspicion, living as minor nobles under Carolingian rule. Even today, conspiracy theorists point to the Prieuré de Sion myths, claiming Merovingian descendants survived into modern times. While most scholars dismiss these tales as fantasy, they reveal something profound. The Merovingians never truly died in the imagination of Europe. They became ghosts haunting the margins of history, their legacy too potent to vanish entirely. The irony is thick. Childeric, the last of his line, may have vanished without a trace, but the dynasty's mysticism only grew stronger in absence. While the Carolingians built empires and crowned emperors, the Merovingians became legends. Their story rewritten first as cautionary tale, then as prophecy, and finally as obsession. In the end, the kings who had ruled by divine hair were undone by a pair of shears, but no blade could cut them from the collective memory. Burying a Merovingian king wasn't just a funeral, it was theater, a final act designed to dazzle both the living and the divine. Nowhere is this more evident than in the tomb of Childeric I, discovered in 1653 by construction workers in Tournai. Imagine their shock as their shovels struck not just dirt but gold, a hoard so lavish it included a solid gold bull's head, a jeweled sword, 300 golden bees, later inspiration for Napoleon's imperial emblem, and a signet ring bearing the king's face with the inscription Childeric's I Regis. This wasn't a hidden treasure, it was a statement, a deliberate display of power meant to echo through eternity. The grave goods tell us more than inventories ever could. Those 300 bees, likely remnants of a cloak or shroud, their gold stitching long decayed, a symbol borrowed from Roman military regalia, hinting at how deeply Childeric admired and emulated Rome's imperial legacy. His sword, its hilt inlaid with garnets, wasn't just a weapon. It was a diplomatic artifact, its craftsmanship showing ties to workshops as far away as Constantinople. Even the horses buried nearby spoke volumes. These weren't mere steeds but status symbols, their sacrifice a declaration that their rider's authority extended into the afterlife. Yet the real revelation lies in what's missing. Unlike earlier Frankish burials heavy with pagan imagery, Childeric's tomb shows no overt Christian signs, no crosses, no biblical inscriptions. This was a king straddling two worlds. His grave goods whispered of Roman prestige and Germanic warrior culture, while his successors would embrace Christianity openly. Archaeologists call it a transitional burial, a snapshot of a dynasty reinventing itself before our eyes. Other Merovingian tombs paint a fuller picture. Take Queen Arnegun's burial in St. Denis, her skeleton still draped in a Byzantine-style silk gown fastened with that legendary garnet buckle. Or the recently excavated grave of a 6-year-old prince near Cologne, surrounded by a miniature sword and shield, proof that royal blood trumped age in their hierarchy. Every brooch, every coin, every shattered pottery vessel whispers secrets about trade routes stretching to Egypt, about metalworkers whose skills defied the so-called Dark Ages, about a belief system where death wasn't an end but a continuation of status. The most haunting detail, many of these graves were robbed within decades, almost certainly by people who knew exactly where to dig. It suggests a chilling possibility that the Merovingians' own descendants may have plundered their ancestors' tombs during times of crisis, melting down heirlooms to pay armies or buy alliances. Even in death, these kings were never truly allowed to rest. Their gold was too useful, their legacy too liquid. Today, what remains scattered across museums from Paris to Berlin offers glimpses not just of how the Merovingians died, but how they lived as showmen, strategists, and believers in a world where power didn't stop at the grave's edge. The moment the last Merovingian king vanished into monastery shadows, the legends began whispers that the sacred bloodline hadn't truly ended but slipped underground, waiting for its triumphant return. Few dynasties have inspired such elaborate myths of survival, from medieval troubadours singing of lost kings to modern conspiracy theories weaving the family into tales of holy relics and secret societies. At the heart of these stories lies a tantalizing question. What if Childeric III's tonsure wasn't the end, but merely an intermission? One of the earliest whispers comes from an unlikely source. The monks of St. Ghislaine, who quietly recorded in their chronicles that a certain prince of the old blood had fled eastward after Pepin's coup, finding refuge among the Saxons. Whether true or not, the idea took root. By the 12th century, French poets like Chrétien de Troyes wove Merovingian echoes into Arthurian legends, hinting that their lineage might be tied to the Fisher King, the mystical guardian of the Holy Grail. The Grail itself, often depicted as a chalice, began to merge with another myth, the idea that the Merovingians weren't just kings, but descendants of Christ himself, their bloodline carrying divine grace. Jump to the 20th century, and the myths exploded into pop culture. The infamous Priory of Sion hoax, fabricated in the 1950s by a French monarchist named Pierre Plantard, claimed this secret society had safeguarded Merovingian heirs for centuries, waiting to restore them to power. Plantard's forged documents, including the infamous dossier secrets, tied the family to everything from the Knights Templar to Leonardo da Vinci, suggesting a vast conspiracy hiding in plain sight. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code later turbocharged these claims, framing the Merovingians as the true heirs of Europe, their legacy suppressed by the Church. But why does this particular dynasty, more than any other, inspire such obsession? Part of it lies in their deliberate mystique, the uncut hair, the sea monster ancestry, the way they straddled paganism and Christianity like no other royal house. Their abrupt disappearance left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. So storytellers filled it, turning historical footnotes into prophecy. Even today, genealogists and amateur sleuths scour European records for traces of lost Merovingian branches, often conflating common Frankish names with royal blood. The truth, as always, is less glamorous. No credible evidence supports a surviving Merovingian dynasty, and Plantard's forgeries have been thoroughly debunked. Yet the persistence of these myths reveals something profound, not about history but about us. The Merovingians became a blank canvas, a way to explore our fascination with hidden truths, sacred bloodlines, and the idea that power never truly fades, it just goes underground. In the end, maybe the real legacy isn't in their DNA, but in our endless hunger to believe that some stories are too grand to ever really end. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code didn't just sell millions of copies, it rewrote the Merovingian legacy for the modern imagination. Overnight, a dynasty once relegated to dusty history books became the centerpiece of a global conspiracy theory. Their story twisted into a thriller about holy bloodlines, secret societies, and a church desperate to bury the truth. But how much of Brown's blockbuster bore any resemblance to reality? The answer lies somewhere between creative license and pure fantasy. Take his central claim that the Merovingians were direct descendants of Jesus Christ through Mary Magdalene, a lineage guarded by the shadowy Priory of Sion. It's a gripping premise, but historically, it's built on quicksand. The real Priory of Sion was a whimsical hoax cooked up in the 1950s by a French conman named Pierre Plantard, who later admitted to forging the ancient documents Brown treated as fact. Yet the damage, or perhaps the magic, was done. Brown's version of the Merovingians as mystical royalty, their bloodline carrying divine grace, seeped into pop culture like ink into parchment. Suddenly, tour guides in Rennes-le-Château, a sleepy French village with tenuous ties to Merovingian lore, found themselves overrun with Da Vinci Code pilgrims clutching dog-eared paperbacks. Hollywood leaned in, too. Films like The Last Templar and Revelation spun similar tales of hidden heirs and church cover-ups, while video games like Assassin's Creed wove Merovingian motifs into their labyrinthine plots. The irony, these kings who once ruled through raw political cunning were now reduced to plot devices in someone else's fairy tale. What's fascinating isn't just the inaccuracies, but what they reveal about our obsession with lost royalty. Brown didn't invent the Merovingians' mystique, he amplified it. Their real history already dripped with symbolism, the uncut hair, the sea monster ancestry, the abrupt downfall. These were ingredients begging for myth-making, but where Brown and his imitators went wrong was in glamorizing their mystery at the expense of their achievements. The Merovingians weren't passive vessels of sacred blood. They were shrewd rulers who navigated the collapse of Rome, fused Germanic and Christian traditions, and laid the groundwork for medieval Europe. Their alliances with the church weren't about hiding a cosmic secret, they were about survival in a fractured world. Even the do-nothing kings of their decline got a makeover in pop culture, often portrayed as tragic figures rather than the political nonentities they'd become. Take the History Channel's Merovingian Dynasty, The Lost Kings, which framed Childeric III's deposition as a spiritual crime, a severing of divine right. Never mind that he'd been a puppet for decades, the story demanded martyrdom. This rewriting isn't harmless. It reduces a complex dynasty to a single, salacious idea, that history's greatest secrets are buried, waiting to explode. The truth, the Merovingians' real secrets were in their laws, their art, their ability to adapt. But who'd buy a thriller about tax policies and diplomatic marriages? Still, there's a silver lining to the Da Vinci Code effect. However mangled the details, Brown's phenomenon did something remarkable. It dragged the Merovingians out of academic journals and into dinner-table debates. For all its flaws, the book sparked a renewed interest in early medieval history, sending readers down rabbit holes of actual research. Universities reported spikes in enrollment for medieval studies courses, while documentaries like The Real Da Vinci Code scrambled to separate fact from fiction. In the end, the Merovingians got what all legends crave, a second act. Just don't expect their ghosts to thank Dan Brown for it. The Merovingian legal code, known as Salic Law, might have been written 15 centuries ago, but its fingerprints are all over modern Europe, especially when it comes to who gets to wear a crown. At first glance, these Frankish laws seem like dusty relics, filled with fines for stolen pigs and disputes over plowed fields. But buried in that legal jargon was a bombshell clause that would shape kingdoms for generations, the principle that women couldn't inherit land and, by extension, thrones. What started as a practical rule to keep property within Frankish families became a political weapon, twisting its way into the DNA of European monarchy. Take France's so-called Salic succession. Long after the Merovingians faded, their legal ghost haunted the Capetian and Valois dynasties, who weaponized the old Frankish law to block queens from ruling. In 1328, when King Charles IV died without a male heir, French nobles dusted off Salic Law to justify skipping his daughter, and even his sister handing the throne to a cousin instead. This wasn't just tradition, it was deliberate myth-making. By framing their power grab as an ancient Frankish custom, the nobility turned sexism into constitutional law. The precedent stuck like glue. Centuries later, when Henry V of England married Catherine of Valois and claimed the French crown through her lineage, the French retort was pure Salic. No woman can transmit a right she does not possess. Yet the law's influence didn't stop at royal bloodlines. Its obsession with patrilineal inheritance seeped into everyday life, shaping property rights across feudal Europe. In Germanic regions, versions of Salic law dictated that farms pass intact to eldest sons, preventing the division of estates, a direct echo of Merovingian attempts to keep their kingdom from splintering. Even Napoleon, that self-crowned revolutionary, borrowed from Salic principles when drafting his civil code, ensuring that wives and daughters remained second-class heirs. The irony, the Merovingians never intended their laws to become eternal. Salic law was flexible in their hands, constantly revised to fit new realities. But later rulers froze it in amber, cherry-picking clauses to serve their agendas. The same legal system that once unified the Franks became a tool for exclusion, its nuances flattened into slogans. When Spain's Isabella the Catholic took the throne despite Salic-inspired opposition in the 15th century, it wasn't just a victory for her, it was a crack in a framework that had stifled queens for 1,000 years. What makes Salic law's legacy so fascinating isn't just its longevity, but its mutability. A code meant to solve 6th century tribal disputes became the cornerstone of medieval nationalism, then a cudgel against gender equality. It proves a timeless truth: laws outlive their makers and the past never really dies. It just gets reinterpreted to suit the present. The Merovingians wrote the rules, but it was history that decided how to play them. By the time Viking longships first darkened the shores of Francia in the late 8th century, the Merovingian dynasty had already become a ghost of its former self, its kings reduced to ceremonial figureheads while Carolingian mayors wielded real power. But the roots of Francia's vulnerability to these Scandinavian raiders ran deeper than political weakness. The Merovingians' slow fragmentation of the kingdom, dividing it again and again among heirs, had left the coastlines undermanned and defenses scattered. Where Clovis or Dagobert might have rallied a unified army to meet invaders head-on, their successors could barely govern their own fractured courts, let alone coordinate a response to swift-moving raiders striking undefended monasteries and trading posts. The Vikings didn't just exploit Francia's chaos, they were drawn to it. Norse traders had long known the Frankish realm as a land of wealthy churches and undefended treasure, thanks to centuries of Merovingian patronage of monastic centers like St. Denis and Luxeuil. These monasteries, once symbols of royal piety, now glittered like unguarded jewel boxes for raiders. The first recorded Viking attack in 799, a raid on the island of Noirmoutier, targeted the very infrastructure the Merovingians had built, a monastic outpost rich in liturgical silver and precious manuscripts. It was a cruel irony. The dynasty's cultural legacy had become its own people's undoing. Yet the Merovingians' indirect role in the Viking crisis goes even further. Their legal innovations, particularly the Salic law's emphasis on partible inheritance, had created a society where younger sons, denied land, often turned to mercenary work or piracy. Sound familiar? The same pressures that sent Frankish noblemen roaming for plunder in the 6th century now drove Scandinavian warriors outward in the 8th. And without a strong central authority to guard the coasts, a system the Merovingians had dismantled through constant partitions, Francia became the perfect hunting ground. The Carolingians, of course, would bear the brunt of these raids, with Charlemagne himself said to have wept upon spotting Viking ships near his palace at Aachen. But the blueprint for disaster was Merovingian, a kingdom so fractured by internal divisions that even the mighty Charles Martel's reforms couldn't fully shore up its defenses. When the great heathen army stormed Paris in 845, they weren't just attacking a Carolingian city, they were capitalizing on a vulnerability centuries in the making. The Merovingians hadn't just lost their throne. Their legacy of fragmentation had unwittingly paved the way for a new era of chaos, one that would reshape Europe all over again. The Merovingian kings may have faded into history, but their saints never did. Men and women whose legends grew so powerful they eclipsed the dynasty itself. Among them, none shone brighter than Genevieve, the shepherd girl turned patron saint of Paris, whose story wove itself into the city's identity long after the last Merovingian was forgotten. Born around 420 in Nanterre, she was just 7 years old when legend claims Bishop Germanus of Auxerre prophesied her destiny, placing a bronze coin in her hand that miraculously turned to gold. By the time Attila the Hun threatened Paris in 451, Genevieve had become something more than human, a figure whose prayers, chroniclers swore, diverted the scourge of God away from the city's gates. But here's the twist. Her greatest political miracle came decades later, when she allegedly convinced Clovis to spare the lives of defeated prisoners after his conquest of Paris. Overnight, a saint became a kingmaker, her spiritual authority so vast that even the fiercest Merovingian warlords sought her blessing. Genevieve's cult didn't just survive the dynasty's fall, it thrived. When Vikings sacked Paris in the 9th century, her relics were hurried to safety, and when the city rebuilt, her shrine became the heart of the left bank. The irony is rich. The church that helped usher out the Merovingians kept their saints alive, repackaging them as symbols of a unified Christian franchise. Genevieve's bones were paraded during plagues, her name invoked in droughts, her feast day celebrated with processions that outshone royal coronations. By the Middle Ages, she'd been retrofitted into a Carolingian-friendly icon, her ties to Clovis softened into a generic defender of France. The Merovingians had become inconvenient, but their saints. Those were PR gold. Then there's Saint Eligius, the goldsmith-turned bishop who straddled the line between sacred and secular like no other. A trusted advisor to Dagobert I, Eligius wasn't just a holy man, he was a political operator who used his workshop as a backchannel for diplomacy. His most enduring legacy, the Royal Mint at Paris, where he designed coins bearing Dagobert's image, literally stamping Merovingian authority onto every transaction. After his death in 660, his cult spread like wildfire, especially among artisans. Medieval guilds adopted him as their patron, turning a Merovingian courtier into a folk hero. Even today, French goldsmiths celebrate his feast day, a living thread connecting modern craftsmen to a 7th century saint who knew power wasn't just about prayer, it was about shaping metal and minds. But perhaps the strangest afterlife belongs to Queen Radegund, the Thuringian princess turned Merovingian queen turned ascetic nun. After fleeing her brutal husband, Clothar I, she founded the monastery of the Holy Cross at Poitiers, turning her courtly connections into a network of influence that rivaled any king's. Her relics, a sliver of the true cross sent from Byzantium, became a magnet for pilgrims, and her letters to emperors and bishops reveal a woman who wielded piety like a diplomat's pen. When she died in 587, her funeral drew crowds so massive they trampled the monastery gardens. Centuries later, when Elena of Aquitaine needed to bolster her own legitimacy, she made a point of visiting Radegund's tomb, tying her rule to a Merovingian saint who'd proven queens could outmaneuver kings. What unites these figures isn't just their holiness, but their adaptability. Genevieve became the spirit of Paris, Eligius the patron of labor, Radegund the model of pious resistance, each reinvented to serve new eras while carrying whispers of the old. The Merovingians themselves were buried, but their saints walked on, their relics working miracles for dynasties that had erased their names. In the end, the family's truest legacy wasn't in crowns or conquests, but in the way their world's spiritual fabric refused to fray, proof that some power outlasts even the sharpest shears. The question of whether the Merovingians were incompetent rulers or casualties of a Carolingian smear campaign has divided historians for centuries, and the answer depends entirely on who you ask. Take Gregory of Tours, the 6th century bishop whose history of the Franks remains our primary window into the dynasty's early years. His account paints a vivid but contradictory picture. On one hand, he praises Clovis's unification of Gaul and conversion to Christianity. On the other, he describes later Merovingian kings as violent, capricious, and morally bankrupt. But here's the catch: Gregory wrote under the patronage of these very kings. His criticisms often align suspiciously with political agendas, like when he savagely condemns Chilperic I, a ruler known for taxing the church, while softening his portrayal of the more pious Sigebert. This isn't history, it's selective storytelling, proof that even contemporary sources were spinning narratives. Modern scholars like Patrick Geary argue this bias was weaponized by the Carolingians. When Pepin the Short deposed Childeric III, his court historians went into overdrive, recasting the preceding century as the era of do-nothing kings, a convenient label to justify their coup. Archaeologists, however, tell a different story. Excavations at Merovingian palaces in Metz and Paris reveal workshops, tax records, and diplomatic correspondence, evidence of administrations that functioned long after the Carolingians claimed they'd collapsed. Even Gregory's much-mocked tales of royal debauchery, like the king who allegedly burned tax ledgers for warmth, might be coded critiques of fiscal policies, not proof of incompetence. Then there's the shadow government theory championed by historians like Ian Wood. He suggests the late Merovingians weren't weak, they were pragmatic. By delegating military and bureaucratic tasks to mayors like Pepin of Herstal, they preserved their sacred status while avoiding the messy work of governance. It's a strategy seen in other dynasties like Japan's emperor-shogun system. The Carolingians didn't overthrow incompetence, they usurped experts in symbolic rule. But perhaps the most damning evidence against the do-nothing myth comes from the Merovingians themselves. Their law codes, coinage, and church-building projects reveal a sustained effort to maintain order. When Viking raids began in the 8th century, it wasn't Merovingian disarray that left Francia vulnerable, it was Carolingian infighting, the same divisive inheritance politics the Merovingians had pioneered. The victors wrote the history, but the artifacts whisper a truth. The Merovingians didn't fail because they were bad rulers. They failed because their successors were better propagandists. Imagine unraveling the genetic code of kings, peeling back 15 centuries to find the biological fingerprints of Clovis or Dagobert hidden in modern DNA. That's the tantalizing promise of the Merovingian DNA project, an ambitious effort to trace Europe's most enigmatic dynasty through strands of heredity instead of parchment. But like so much with the Merovingians, the science is tangled in legend, politics, and a surprising number of dead ends. The quest began in earnest when archaeologists exhumed Childeric I's tomb in 1653, not for his genes but his gold. His bones were lost in a 19th century heist, leaving only artifacts behind. Fast forward to 2016, when geneticists turned their attention to Queen Arnegund, whose remarkably preserved skeleton lay in St. Denis. Her mitochondrial DNA, passed unchanged from mother to child, revealed haplogroup H, one of the most common lineages in Europe today. On one hand, this confirmed her aristocratic Germanic roots. On the other, it proved frustratingly generic. You could walk into any Paris cafe today and find a dozen people sharing Arnegund's genetic signature. Then came the bombshell claim from a 2019 study analyzing bones from the Köln Cathedral. Researchers identified a cluster of skeletons with rare Y chromosome markers, suggesting a distinct paternal line possibly linked to Merovingian elites. But here's the catch: without direct comparison to a verified Merovingian king's DNA, which we may never recover, it's like finding a key without knowing which lock it fits. The Carolingians made sure of that. When they deposed Childeric III, they didn't just shear his hair, they scrubbed his bloodline from history, leaving no confirmed royal tombs to test. The deeper scientists dig, the murkier it gets. Some private genealogy firms claim to trace clients back to Merovingian nobles through parish records and genetic clusters, but these often rely on shaky assumptions. One viral ancestry report in 2021 tied a Belgian family to Dagobert based on a rare mutation, only for critics to point out the same marker appears in Viking-era Danish burials. Compounding the chaos are medieval chroniclers themselves, who exaggerated Merovingian otherness, claiming their long hair marked divine ancestry or even supernatural origins. If you're hunting for sea monster DNA, good luck. Perhaps the most fascinating twist isn't in labs but courtrooms. In 2008, a French aristocrat sued to block DNA testing of a putative Merovingian relic, the Saint Remy's vial, said to contain Clovis's baptismal oil. His argument, science might debunk 1,000 years of tradition. The case exposed a truth geneticists grapple with: the Merovingians aren't just historical figures. They're mythic vessels, their bloodlines carrying weight no double helix can measure. Even if we someday sequence a Merovingian genome, will it tell us more than their laws, their art, or their ruthless politics already have? Or will it just be another strand in the legend, one more thread in a tapestry they wove themselves, half history, half spell? The Merovingians didn't fade quietly into history. They left behind a legacy as tangled as the roots of their sacred forests. From their mythical rise under Clovis, the warrior king who baptized an empire in blood and holy water, to their golden age of glittering manuscripts and shrewd statecraft, this was a dynasty that shaped Europe in ways we're still untangling. They forged a kingdom from the ruins of Rome, blending Germanic brute force with Christian pageantry, their long-haired kings straddling two worlds like living bridges between the ancient and medieval. But power, as they learned, is a slippery thing. The same laws that unified the Frank Salic inheritance, sacred kinship, became the cracks in their foundation, splitting the realm with each generation until rival nobles and ambitious mayors could step into the gaps. Their fall wasn't sudden, it was death by 1,000 cuts, partitions weakening their grip, Carolingians co-opting their authority, and finally, that fateful shearing of Childeric III's hair, a symbolic end to a line that had once claimed descent from sea monsters. Yet here's the haunting part: the Merovingians never really disappeared. Their ghosts linger in the laws that barred queens from thrones, in the saint cults that outlived their kings, even in the conspiracy theories that whisper of hidden bloodlines. They became a paradox, a dynasty too potent to forget but too dangerous to remember fully. So were they Europe's lost rulers, a golden thread snipped too soon? Or was their fate sealed the moment they traded battlefield might for borrowed holiness, letting their power become more symbol than substance? History offers no easy answers, only clues. Maybe the truth lies in the artifacts they left behind. The garnet buckles whispering of Byzantine alliances, the coins stamped with Latin mottos, the tombs where warriors slept beside gospel books. Or perhaps it's in the question they force us to confront: how much of rulership is real, and how much is just a story we agree to tell. Now it's your turn. Were the Merovingians architects of their own downfall, or victims of a Carolingian coup? Could they have survived if they'd clung to swords instead of sacraments? Drop your theories below, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be debated, one comment